So, Neil, Dan, thanks a lot for spending the time. We just thought I'd begin really just with a general question about what brought you both to the centre in the first place.
Do you want to kick off?
Yeah, well, I was teaching up in Yorkshire, in Keighley, at Bradford, that area, and I was going to apply to do a master's degree at Bradford. I'd explored it, and I had conversations with people in Birmingham, friends, who suggested I apply here, and was given the opportunity to go and stay on a friend's front room if I did get a place. I applied, got a place to do masters on the first taught MA course, which ran from 75 to 76, without any funding. So we came down, paid our own fees, and I lived on part-time earnings as a teacher. So that's how I arrived in Birmingham, and that's where I met Dan. Dan was, you just finished at Warwick, hadn't you?
Yep, so I'd been at Warwick for 3 years, worked a bit before that, got the sociology degree, and focused a lot on a dissertation which I was very interested in, and got the bug for learning. Also had the bug for not working in dead-end work, which I've been doing before, and worked out that as a student there was a possibility of getting some grants. So I hustled around. I was very lucky. I got sponsored by people like Paul Corrigan and Simon Frith, who'd been hooked up with some of the youth cultures work that was going on at the centre at that point. Suggested that I come along. I went to one of the subgroup meetings, then applied for one of the PhD studentships, which I was given, to basically kind of tread in the footsteps of Paul Willis, essentially. So I didn't do the master's degree. I came straight in as a PhD entrant, and then was off doing my own research in the middle of Wednesbury.
And like before you arrived, did the centre have were you aware of the centre's reputation, or did it have a reputation that you knew of sort of before you got to Birmingham?
I mean, I knew of it, but because, I mean, for example, I met Michael Green back in, must have been end of 1970, 71, when friends who moved down to Birmingham lived near him, so I knew of the fact he was connected to the centre, and Angela Lloyd I'd met then, so this is going 40 odd years ago now. So there were people I knew, and I knew about Stuart Hall, and I'd seen Stuart when I was doing my first degree at one of the National Deviancy Symposium meetings over in York with Laurie Taylor and Jock Young and people. So I knew Stuart by sight, but I didn't know him, and I knew of his work and so on. But I can't say until the point when it was first presented as an opportunity to come and do a master's that I'd ever really thought about the place, and it was then that I began to read it. So I knew a little bit more when I arrived.
How about you?
I knew very little, other than I could get a grant if I came here.
So it's for you, it's kind of more of an economic thing, really, trying.
Partly economic, but also the definitely the kind of group of work that was going on. It's the stuff that then goes into the youth cultures kind of work, John Clark, people like that, and in particular the knowledge about what Paul Willis was working on. He hadn't published by then, but the stuff he was starting to do about how working class kids get working class jobs echoed with the stuff that I'd done my dissertation on, which was about raising the school leaving age.
I mean, what was the atmosphere like when you arrived there? And, you know, how was that different to or similar to previous experience of higher education?
No, the same kind of alienating, kind of strange experience, living in a bedsit in a strange city. But I had a bird this time. Oh, I shouldn't say that. I was in a relationship with a woman at that point in time, and we lived in a tiny little bloody bedsit in the middle of Edgbaston. So it was, it wasn't difficult, but it was kind of, it took a little while to get to know people. A few weeks anyways.
Oh, and I just found it really very, very stimulating from day one. Because I knew Birmingham, I got friends here who had been connected. Steve Butters was my point of contact. Steve was never part of the centre, but he was connected to friendship networks, and he used to teach in the sociology department in the early 70s at the uni. So that was, I actually knew people socially in Birmingham, but not at the Cultural Studies Centre. But when I arrived, I suddenly found a group of people who were all doing the masters. We were all defined in the same way, so we had an immediate friendship group, affiliation network, through the Masters Taught course, which you didn't really have, did you? In
No,
the first instance.
No, I
you,
was just a hanger on eventually.
Yeah.
But I worked out that I came down a pub, so I did as well. So.
yeah. But I mean, the reason thinking back actually, the reason I came and thought about Birmingham was because I've been discussing with Steve about public discourse around, in the context of education debate, specifically the reception of the publication of education reports, and specifically the Bullock report, which is Language for Life, about literacy, and I was interested in the whole kind of discourse around that and the media discourse. So I first discussed the idea of doing some kind of research work about that, because I was interested in the historical dimensions of that. Was running a comparative. And it was in that context Steve said, well, that's the kind of thing that Centre might be interested in, and you should think about coming and doing a Masters and exploring that as one of your areas of interest. So when I arrived, I was immediately involved in discussions around education.
And to be fair, the subgroups were a good way in.
So the education group was formed during that period.
Yeah, and I don't know how quickly it came about, but certainly there was I think it was kind of a methodology one. Paul Willis was one of the key people in it. But others, I think it was more the people who were doing empirical kind of thesis. And it was both intended as a kind of support, given the absence of supervision. So that was a kind of quite useful way, but then definitely the education group. And one of the good things about the working paper stuff is, man, you were straight in it. You got it right. It was, issue number 9, wasn't it? That was straight away kind of on the agenda. Via a few sets of papers.
Can you remember where that agenda came from? I mean, was Richard involved in it?
Or Richard was interested, because Richard was teaching on the MA course, and I think I did my dissertation, MA long essay. I think it was substantial, but I was beginning to explore some of the stuff around literacy debates and the political context of those debates. So I was into the territory, and Dan came from a very different direction, and Richard had another one which sort of encompassed both, but drew on both.
Well, yeah, and his own kind of work on the history of popular movements, 19th century kind of education and things like that. So it then made a fit, and then there was I think certainly one of the kind of features to me was about the networks that were around. So I think maybe intellectually I wasn't as strong in the internal networks, but there were a number of other kind of parallel kind of radical networks which overlap with things that were going on in the centre. So one of the routes that I came through, this was partly Warwick, was Conference of Socialist Economists, Capital and Class, that kind of version of Marxist kind of analysis, through to then the kind of growing Socialist Teachers Alliance network, radical education. So there was a whole ferment out there.
Yeah, likewise. I was very involved in the NUT when I was in Bradford, because I've been teaching for 3 years. First of all, I was teaching a full-time FE teacher in Leeds, and then full-time, part-time, that is. And then I did 2 years in a secondary school before I came down here. So I was interested in all that, the education politics as well, and I was involved in or close to socialist teachers and.
I think that took a little while to get going. The working paper's 9. I remember kind of like almost immediately. You were into a discipline. You were in a subgroup. Each subgroup's got to start writing articles.
But the first thing we did really, as I recall, anyway, at the end of '76, when we really got the education group going, because it was after I'd done my masters.
Number 9 was the Roy Peters one, wasn't it? That was an earlier one.
Was that just
talking about 70? Was it 74?
Oh, number 9 was 76. Yeah.
Right.
So the publication work had done 75, I think, 75 into 76. But that was pre-education group, or the education group was only just getting going, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah.
This is all subgroups in it.
It was an ideology but the paper, working paper, was published before. Then it was subsequently incorporated in on ideology.
Well, where did the impetus for that come from? I mean, what was your motivation? Was it just the atmosphere at the time that kind of led you to be thrown into the deep end? Everyone around you was kind of, interested in publishing. Because what's interesting is that a lot of people I've spoken to, that they don't seem to have been that overt emphasis on sort of having an academic career, but there was this kind of motivation to publish and to do the publications. So where did that motivation actually come from? Was it a political thing for you?
Partly, also because you've got to be shown to be doing things. You get paid a grant, and it seemed a good way to kind of do things. And also it was a really kind of good, powerful kind of learning kind of tool. It was bad news if you wanted to do a PhD, but it was a powerful way of getting people to kind of understand kind of timescales. I think most people who came in, my own experience was they had some kind of political experience, they had a bit of kind of self-discipline, they knew that, you can have a fairly good time, but this was an intellectual project, and you were committed to kind of churning certain things out, even if it meant just rolling your sleeves up and churning the old bloody stencil papers out on Wednesday afternoons. I think most of it used to kind of take place,
I mean, in terms of my formation, I was at the Teacher Training College, 67 through to 71, although last year I was at Leeds University undergraduate to do my BA. But when I was a student, I was very involved in student politics. I was vice president of the union for a while. I ran the Socialist Society and in the college, and we started it and we ran it. And I was involved with other people with sort of content critique already when I was a student. I remember we did one thing which I was only peripherally involved in, but it was a critique of iSyncs, positivistic intelligence testing, IQ stuff, which we published, which had quite a big circulation, and that was just done as a student intervention, along with one or two academics who did bits as well. So there was a background for me, but the idea if you were engaged in serious intellectual work, then if people thought it appropriate, then you'd publish stuff. Right. So, but prior to doing on ideology, the first thing we redid in the autumn of '76, or before Social Democracy Education in the Crisis, do you remember we did a detailed analysis of the various education reports over several weeks? At working the seminars, Frith and Corrigan were involved. I think Henry Miller got involved during that period as well. And there was a group of people who came, and we did detailed analysis of certainly the post-war education publications to get this sense from the 30s and so on. So for me, that was a direct relation to things I've been involved in. So I remember all that quite vividly. And it was the first time people were coming on and saying, well, such and such a report represented a certain moment. This is what was going on politically. These were the issues that were being picked up. This is how it was covered in the press at the time. This is what came out of it. These were things that were proposed that were enacted or not enacted and so on. So we're beginning to get a grasp of some of the discourse around the various moments,
It sounds like you both sort of like, prior to coming to the centre, came from sort of a left-wing kind of broadly anyway. Oh, yeah. And the centre obviously had quite a complex array of left-wing politics, from Big Flame to IOG to whatever.
To the Trots, various views. And
how did your political background and outlook fit in with that array of politics that was going on at the centre at that time?
It was interesting. I've always been mainstream Labour. I was like on the left in that kind of period, and so influenced by it, but a bit probably slightly at a distance, just because I come from a different kind of, not a different tradition, but it was just a bit more mainstream Labour. But got caught up, like everybody else at the centre did, with trying to bring down the Labour government, little realising what we were helping to let in. So I feel a bit kind of irresponsible during that period.
I don't think we played much of a role.
I don't know. From Cromwick to bloody firemen's disputes, and it was a pattern of the time. Sorry, that's a kind of a longer kind of political discussion about the movements of people. But there's no doubt about it. You had to be left of centre and have a political sensibility and interest to be here. I can't imagine what it would be like if you didn't. There certainly weren't any right wingers. There was some really strange kind of like Ulster. My first Ulster Marxist, Protestant Marxist on there. Sorry, I'm from an Irish Catholic background, so that was a very interesting. The guy did the Loch Ness Monster.
Paul Lester.
Yeah.
Oh, Paul Lester.
So that was a fascinating experience for me.
Was Lester from the north?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even realise he was Irish.
I'm pretty sure it was.
Yeah, I think I've seen there's bits in the archive of him writing letters about.
Oh yes, I was familiar with all his debates about the rights to accede and so on.
Yeah, but it was interesting. So that was fascinating. So all that kind of maelstrom of ideas, and you're right, there wasn't a sense of career then, and there wasn't. But equally, I don't think the kind of nature of academic careers now. Maybe we were just. It was different. I came through it. I didn't have any experience of higher education. My family never did. But the notion of doing peer-reviewed articles and building up a kind of set of things like that alongside doing a conventional kind of PhD, that wasn't the reason you were here, I think. Clearly not, because very few people finished on site, so...
If at all.
Exactly.
Me, yeah.
Exactly.
How about you, Neil? What was your kind of reflections of the kind of the politics, or the broad politics of the centre, and where your own politics?
Well, I mean, I think, what Jan's saying, right, I mean, it was all, everybody's left of centre, but within that, it's a broad church, really. I mean, in the same way that, we've got Labour. I mean, my background was Labour Party, but moments of revolutionary enthusiasm as a student. But, I was a young socialist when I was at school. When I was 16, 17, I was in Labour Party, young socialist. And I think when I first came to this, when I was at college, I was in the Labour Party for quite a long time and left. And
we always sort of had a hankering for a kind of revolutionary transformation of society. Yeah. Basically. From the top floor of Muirhead Tower, everything seemed possible.
And was that bound up with the intellectual work? Like, were the two separated out? Like, this is our political outlook, this is our intellectual work. Or did you see them being combined? Like, we're doing the intellectual work for the political.
I suppose so. I suppose they don't press me on the detail. I think it was just the general feeling.
Yeah, and it was partly also because again, it was a kind of lifestyle politics as well. My partner, who I was with, got she moved up here with me and then got very heavily involved in a kind of radical red theatre group. So it was that kind of milieu.
Banner Theatre, was it?
Was it Red Ladder?
It was Red Ladder, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. So there was that milieu around as well. So it was, it wasn't just what happened inside the centre, but equally, the centre influence. Mind you, the last thing she wanted me to talk about was fucking Gramsci or Altus there or all that kind of stuff. I
was going to say that's one of the things I was going to ask, is that obviously a lot of things, the thing that most people associate, or one of the things most people associate with the centre, is this embrace of continental theory. Do you have any reflections of that process and its influence?
I think for me, it was the adoption of a conceptual vocabulary which sort of suddenly made sense of things in a conceptual framework and ways of describing things, which I think I'd struggled with because I started reading New Left Review back in the end of the 60s, so I read stuff, but quite often I couldn't fully grasp what the full nature of the debates were. But as it happened, because I'd got all the journals, when it came to the master's course, some of these debates, the Nairn Anderson debates and Nairn Anderson Thompson debates, I'd got them all. So rereading all stuff, it suddenly began to make sense because I hadn't connected this with that, a couple of years later. So suddenly it began to make sense because I'd never been involved in a milieu where people were actually really following that stuff. I used to follow it in a fairly solitary way, and it was sort of little bits here and that and there. I didn't really appreciate the lay of the land. So I could see the trees, but I couldn't see the wood. So certainly being able to kind of grasp the bigger picture was something that suddenly I found very, very intellectually exciting.
I was more of an empirical kind of bent. So the stuff that got me interested was Gramsci on kind of the whole politics of the Communist Party, political theory about what you did in the 1930s and things like that, through to some of the Altus area stuff, but just because that was nice and simplistic, and I could try and use that in relationship to some of the empirical work I was doing. But the Nairn Anderson stuff, interested in it, but I think that was probably the difference between doing the course and
what you were doing,
doing the kind of more solitary.
But I found that as we got the education group developed, more and more of that began to make sense to me, that we're actually employing some of those debates, that we kind of, or we're working within some of those
Sure, there was some interesting stuff, it wasn't just Marxist, it was Bourdieu was one of the key figures that I remember.
Richard Nice.
Yeah, the translator. And, we spent a few sessions kind of talking through kind of fairly insightful stuff from there. We had, what's his name, Victor
Molina.
Chilean Marxist, talking through a fairly hardline kind of interpretation of bloody hell classical Marxism. It wasn't any of the new continental stuff. It was, well, it was, given the Marxists from Germany, but it was kind of 19th century classical kind of stuff. Yeah, it was interesting stuff. But then that's when the interesting stuff, from my point of view, the personal stuff, was about then the engagement with feminism, which I was doing, happening to me both on a personal basis as well as then it happening here in the centre. You know.
So how did feminism kind of manifest itself from your memory, from your recollection?
I said, listen, shut up, give us some space.
Well, when I remember it coming out of this, certainly the debates really, I mean, it wasn't as if I wasn't familiar with the kind of feminist debates previously, but in terms of a much more highly focused, articulate presence, that was something which was far more 77 onwards really, I think, as I recall it.
Was it quite a masculine environment, a sense of, like, you know, when you arrived, would you say?
I suppose it was.
Yeah, hard, you know.
Heavy smoking.
Everybody smoked.
It was just horrendous, and you could cut the night. I mean, I started smoking again when I was here because I'd stopped for a while. And
quite a bit of drinking, and probably quite a bit of womanising going on as well. So, but you know, there was some pretty bloody strong women. It
went both ways.
Yeah,
but I mean, that's true, I think. But I mean, what the emergence of the kind of feminist presence, or the assertion of that presence, was, I mean, going back to your previous question about the kind of politics, there were individuals who were associated with very clear positions, like Kieran Connell was around this, you know, Communist Party. Greg McLennan's dad was Gordon McLennan, who was General Secretary of the Communist Party at the time nationally, and Greg had come out of that kind of tradition, so was embraced it, but also was critical as well. So there were these people, and then you got people like Robin Rusher, the late Robin Rusher, who was very involved in Big Flame and other people, who really were doing things just before I think the year before we arrived. It was just the tail end of that Big Flame presence, 74, 75 presumably. I think Stuart Daniel was involved, got close to some of that as well. Ian Chambers, who I didn't know, but I think he was involved. And you know better than me about that.
Yeah, I think Ian Chambers also.
But, so you had that kind of libertarian socialist presence as well, and then you've got SWP people around.
I think it was that kind of point at which, you know, the personal being political and that kind of moment when it really started to hit home. I think onto left politics, that, you know, you've got to start thinking differently, and male left politics, and on a personal basis, you know, that was probably one of the most hardest but the most rewarding kind of educational parts of being here on a person, you know, as a person, and learn a fucking lot.
I mean, was there a sense, not don't want to kind of over-egg it, I mean, don't want to use the trauma sounds, it's Freudian almost, but was it kind of a semi-traumatic process to be suddenly, like, you know, to be dealt with this coming from the politics?
Well, I remember when we did Social Democracy Education, the Crisis, the paper which went into an ideology, I remember that was one or two women who were very critical because it didn't engage with feminist issues. It was very much a masculine account, and there was a strong critique of it from that direction.
And that's not an unreasonable kind of line to take. If you know, education's about family, it's about kind of reproductive politics and all those kinds of things. But I think it was also more just about, again, the personal thing, not trauma, that's kind of too strong a word, but more having to be very aware that you're a bloke and you've been constructed in certain kinds of ways, and your behaviour just ain't right anymore, you know, and you've got to think about it. And that wasn't just about the centre, but the centre was part of that kind of curve for me. And I think for a number of other people, a number of other men particularly around the time. But also from my experience, some of the kind of debate and some of the conflict could be bloody negative. You know, I remember going to some of these general meetings, just went on for bloody hours, you know, and frankly after about half an hour I couldn't understand what was going on. I just doodled.
But amongst the women and you, there was all kinds of, I mean, I was picking up lots of feedback from...
yeah, it wasn't a single feminism, was it? You know?
No, and it was the National Women's Conference, and I forget, was it 76, 77 in Birmingham, which was traumatic for quite a few of the women in the sense.
Because that was radical feminism.
The radical feminism being asserted against a kind of socialist feminist explicitly, and on other variants as well.
A bunch of them staying in my house. That's right.
There's people, get very upset about that, and I remember Kath might have talked to you about that. But, and Eve Brooke, I remember.
Yeah, she was. Yeah.
I mean, you talked about a little bit about the subgroups, and what I was going to ask you was, what would you say were the benefits and the disadvantages of working in collaboratively in groups, and how did it actually work in practice?
I mean, to me, it was enormously interesting because, focusing on a particular topic, a particular area, and people coming in from different directions and bringing different perspectives on the same document at the same moment, I just found really interesting.
And we were getting some leading thinkers coming in, people who just kind of, Michael Young, Institute of Education, Willis and, Simon Frith, Corrigan, talking about the kind of work they were doing. So in terms of a lot of thinking at the time, it was, cutting edge stuff, and, again, we were quite fortunate, I think, with the education group, that fairly quickly we were then going out. It wasn't just, it was all internal to the centre, particularly because of the paper we did. We were starting to get invites to go and do kind of seminars and presentations and what have you, and again, that was a very sharp, significant learning curve.
And we'd started doing this when, I remember, we'd started the education work, and what I remember very clearly going across to the Bournebrook for a drink and getting a newspaper, and the headline was a great debate. Callaghan had announced a great debate, which we hadn't picked up. Well, I hadn't picked up anyway. And it was that day, this Ruskin College speech. So it sort of coincided perfectly with what we were.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the reasons we were writing about those kinds of things,
right.
Those themes.
Yeah. So suddenly it was national focus. So it was a good moment to be engaged in those issues because we were ahead of the game really in terms of grasping some of the elements of it.
And because it was at the centre, it probably got more attention than it otherwise might have done, yeah?
Right.
And again, because that whole kind of, again, I don't think the infrastructure is there in the way it was then, but there was a real ferment of lots of kind of conferences, networks, groupings, both trade union based, both education based, which were really interested in exploring some of those kind of things. And Callaghan started the great debate, I guess we were part of it,
I mean, you mentioned the network, and going to good papers and presentations or whatever, but did that extend to sort of networks outside the academy? You mentioned trade unions, but I mean, to what extent was your work in particular, but also the centre in general, engaged with, people outside of academia, outside the ivory tower, if you like?
Most of it was, frankly, that I can remember. Going to the Idle Working Men's Club and doing a presentation.
We weren't the Idle Making.
Wasn't it? No, we just walked past it.
I took you up there. He was working with unemployed youth. And we were invited to do a paper at Bradford Trades Council.
That was it. Yeah. So I just kind of collapsed the two things in my head.
Because the next day, I think it was, I drove round past the Idle Youth Club and the Idle Working Men's Club. So Idle is a district of Bradford. So the Idle Working Men's Club, because it's IDLE, has the biggest membership of any working men's club in the world. Because people all over the world want a membership card for the Idle Working Men's Club and the Idle Youth Club. So again, it has a huge following. And lots of photographs around the world of people like him standing in front of it. So I think I took a picture.
All right, so it was Bradford Trades Club.
It was Bradford Trades Council.
But we did a number of those kind of events.
But we did those, yeah.
And what was this? I mean, were you invited him?
Yeah.
Was that anything that was down to this reputation that the centre had that was developing?
Starting to, and then you would have the kind of quasi-academic kind of things, conference socialists, economists. Sometimes you put yourself forward to do papers. Sometimes you're getting asked to do it.
But I mean, the range of things we did. I remember going to Kiel. We were invited to do a session at Kiel. We did stuff at Leicester.
Yeah, Leicester, definitely remember.
Leicester, up in Bradford. We went down to the...
Rising Hill was the big one, wasn't it?
That was the politics, that was in, whenever it was up 78, I think, the Easter 78, round about that time.
Okay.
I can't remember, it was the day of the grip, it was a big anti-Nazi League demo, I can't remember exactly the dates, but Raymond Williams was on the platform with us. It was packed hall, and I remember it was IMG people who were running it.
There's a whole firm, and it was Social Teachers Alliance.
Yeah. But it was
IMG,
the people who were chairing. There was a woman chairing. It was IMG. I remember, who was involved in Socialist Teachers.
It was sponsored by people like Radical Education, which was a
Yeah.
popular magazine produced by progressive kind of teachers, the left of the NUT. But it was pretty damn big.
And we did a weekend residential, wasn't it residential? Sorry, it was a weekend school at the American school, run by students from the University of London Institute. Do you remember that one? It was in the American school, and I remember there's people like Tony Green.
Oh yeah.
And Mika. And people were around. There's a whole gang of.
Yeah, because we hooked up with them. We did some work with them.
Yeah.
And also internationally as well. I was going to ask you about Roskilde. I got the pronunciation right.
Roskilde, yeah. Well, the first person who went there, I don't know what the actual origins of the connection were. I think it was very much through their interest in Richard Hoggart's work historically, and then Stuart's, they were aware of it. And there were connections between Roskilde University, which was only opened in the early 70s, and people at the Cultural Studies Centre. I think Michael had some connection. And in 77, what's his name? Who did the Limits of Masculinity? Andy Tolson was attached to them. He taught there for a semester, and then they managed to resume the connection back in 79 when they got some more money to employ somebody. And they wrote to me because I knew some of the students who were involved in their planning group, and they'd been interested in the education work, and they knew I was a teacher already, and they wanted somebody who was a teacher and had a higher degree and had worked at the centre. So they said that was their starting point, to employ somebody that had to be a qualified teacher. So I fitted those boxes, and they knew me, and they said, would I go, and if I couldn't, could I help them recruit somebody who fitted that profile? So I said, all right, I'll go.
So did you find when you went that, you know, students or staff were kind of all had an awareness of the work of the centre?
People did, but the thing about reputation is that people knew about the centre as if it was still Hoggart influenced. They thought, because there was no sense, they knew about the centre, but they knew about the centre from several years before. So people would talk to me about, you know, is so-and-so still working on this? And I'm thinking, well, somebody I'd never even met, because they'd moved on before we even arrived. So likewise, well, I met people after I'd really been involved in the centre, in the early 80s when I'd moved away. People still assumed that what we were doing was still alive. There's always those lead times, you know, people find out about it. So certainly in Denmark, there was that sense that what we were doing was somehow from what was going on several years before. Because I did a couple of lectures at Copenhagen University, so invited through people who knew the centre, who wanted me to do seminars really, with people who were interested. And certainly the debate that I was involved in these seminars certainly reflected that. People assumed that they knew about things they'd read a few years before. So they'd be asking, you know, in 79 about Willis's work on motorbike boys from 5 years before.
So it took a bit of time for it to actually...
That's right, you know, people had seen them and they assumed that everything was still as it was. I mean, it's a classic, and I always kept thinking, well, I always right about the essential section, you know, that somehow, you know, when you look at historical things, there are lots of different trends, and people look at something at a certain point and assume it's live. It's not. It's long spent.
Yeah. I was going to ask as well about, this will be different for both of you, because obviously you were doing the Masters and you were doing the PhD, but what, if you can remember, what did an average week look like at the centre? I mean, you mentioned the general meetings, which seemed to go on forever, and I think there was a theory seminar that Stuart was running.
Yeah, but Mike, remember that I was 75, 76, and in 76 a group of us picked up major awards to PhD students. So from 76 onwards I was in the same boat as Dan really. 76 through to 79 I was a PhD student, whereas Dan was a PhD student from 75 to 78. So my funding went a year behind Dan.
Right.
Yep.
So he'd finished. So increasingly our weeks were more similar.
I mean, variations of different things. I mean, certainly my first year, one of the things I was doing was 1 day a week I was spending in a school talking to a bunch of lads about what the experience was like and how they, because it was...
Do you remember which school it was? Was that?
It's up in Wednesbury. I mean, I can picture it, but I can't quite remember the name. But essentially it was partly influenced by what Willis had done, and in the same, he did his in Smethwick, I think it was. But it was literally just trying to engage with these young lads, see how they were living this new relationship. And the key point was that was, I think, the second year, third year, maybe after the school leaving age had been raised from 15 to 16. And this was the group who were the reluctant stayers. They wouldn't have previously stayed on. Ironic, because we're actually going through the same moment historically now. And then the other thing that was happening, which kind of then shifted the way I did, and I did a kind of like harder social policy, public policy kind of route, was then youth unemployment started to explode. And we saw the creation of a thing called, it was already there, but the expansion of mass training and youth opportunities programs targeted at unemployed youth, which at one point were kind of, recruiting like 60% of 16-year-old school leavers. And so the bit I contributed to a lot of the education work was around
training,
the training programs and were their education, and then there was why was it the working class kids were ending up in them, and what they were getting out of them, and what was the notion of skill and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's one moment I think in terms of the education group work, which was, you haven't mentioned, and you may have mentioned it elsewhere, but when I was finishing my masters in the summer of '76, I think we finished it in September or something. But Dan, you'd spent the summer bringing together a massive paper which brought together lots of political stuff. And it was it was a major document, which was actually, I think, one of the defining documents for the way in which that education group worked, because Dan you just brought together the political, the broader media,
the great debate stuff,
and it was Great Debate, really. It's pre-Great Debate.
Yes, I suppose. It was.
I remember this arrived, and I mean, Stuart was very complimentary about it, I remember. Well, we all were.
Well, it was more just, people weren't like, that was the moment at which this thing became worthy of study.
Yeah.
It was, because it was mega, I mean, if this was a transformation and an extension of how working class kids made that transition from school to work. And was part of what education was, but the education debate hadn't really incorporated it or really addressed it.
I remember subsequently lots of what you'd written over that summer was led into the social democracy education, the crisis stuff. It was stretched out, reworked and so on, but it was Dan's intervention that was absolutely crucial in making that happen.
So how did you kind of, doing all that empirical work in Wednesbury and elsewhere, how did you kind of rationalise that, going from that to going to this? You mentioned the general meetings that went on for ages. How was that kind of a strange world to enter from one world in Wednesbury, then back into the centre and doing all these debates about?
A bit, the kind of one of the joining points was someone like Paul Willis, who sort of theoriser, and I don't know if you interviewed Paul yet for this. You're right here.
Track him down if you can.
He's more than able to kind of make those kind of connections. I was never that kind of theoretically inclined. Some of it I found incredibly insightful, useful, sometimes not directly kind of connected to what I was doing. But other stuff was just passed me by, discourse analysis, discourse theory, the Barthes, Derrida, people like this. It was just other people doing that and, get on with it, And so in some senses, I probably did one of the more policy-oriented pieces of work that the Centre actually produced over that kind of period. And I think one of the things about it was I could just get on with it, and I just did,
And I was probably more interested in some of the discourse stuff, but without being wholly sort of involved, because I was interested in the kind of hard edge of that there are people talking about these things and there's a debate going on, but there are actually people doing things as well, and I was interested in concretising that. So when we were doing the education book later, I'd already got involved in the debates about citizenship and very involved in wartime debates and so on, because I was very interested in, there's all this debate going on, but who are the people who are making these things happen? So I was interested in, I remember going to Manchester in the late 70s, and I think you were there, I was staying with you and going through archives, the Salmon archive. The Frau's archive, the working class library up in Wally Range, wasn't it? Or thereabouts.
Just across the road from where I used to live.
That's right, yeah. And which was an extraordinary place. I think all their archive went to.
It's been archived properly. Salford maybe? But anyways,
it was going, when I was there, are you familiar with the Frau's library?
Not too much, no.
No, but it was just, imagine a big semi, which was a library, and they lived in it, in their bedroom. It was lined with books, and there'd be a table like this in the corner, and scholars were invited to come and work there. If your credentials were okay, you need letters of introduction. Came in, so you'd be sitting in their bedroom and say, Edward, have you ever, Edmund Lee was, Ed, have you ever, do you have a copy of Giles' paper for the NUT back in 1940, whatever it was? And he'd go, hang on, get a ladder. And he'd look around, oh, there's a box there, and he'd go up and get a box in whichever room and come down. There you are. It was one of those people, he knew everything, it was extraordinary. And then you'd be sitting reading this, and a cup of tea would arrive and a biscuit.
It was one of the most amazing collections of unpublished, uncollected, working class, trade union and Communist Party kind of related literature that there was.
And International Brigade banners on the stairs.
It was a remarkable thing. I don't know how we got there, but...
Sorry, that was... But I mean, I was saying, I was interested in I was very interested in the practical, who was doing this stuff. So I was working in, I remember working in the archives in Manchester Reference Library, in the Salmon archives with Brian Salmon and his brother give authority for me to actually quote from, because it was their father was Ernest Salmon, who I think Salmon of Wythenshawe, Lord Salmon of Wythenshawe, who was very involved in kind of liberal Labour stuff in the 1930s, and was involved in a thing called Association for Education and Citizenship. So I was interested in all that stuff, and I was given access to the archive. So, and then I remember going through there and finding correspondence between people who were involved in wartime stuff and making, suggesting that so-and-so could organise this because they'd now got a position there and they could approve this. So I was just really excited actually seeing how this discourse was made real in terms of organisational forms.
So the abstract and then the concrete.
The concrete. So I mean, in that respect, I think I was close to Dan in that regard, because it was something that you kind of would take as axiomatic. Yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously the centre had this sort of commitment to breaking down, I guess, some of the conventional barriers between, academic staff and students. I mean, I know that some students sat on the committees for new students to join, or new staff members to join.
The interview committee.
The interview committee. I don't know if
admissions group it was, wasn't it?
Yeah, I sort of remember that. Don't even know if I...
No, but I mean, the thing is, it was legally, it had to be the staff who did that. So it was always a very... It was an advisory thing. De jure, de facto, they made the decision, but for the university's purposes, it had to be the staff who made the decision. So when I was interviewed by Richard, and it was Richard, Stewart, John Clark, I recall, and there were a couple of other people in that group, and it was a long interview, about an hour or so, exploring about all sorts of things, what my application said, what I was interested in, what I might get.
I mean, in light of that commitment there, what was the influence of the staff members, do you think? I mean, what was Stewart and Michael and Richard's influence?
Well, massive practical influence, but also iconic, certainly with Stewart, he was the kind of like figurehead, articulator, and quite pretty charismatic presence, and somebody, one of those kind of people, if you hear a lecture, is a joy to listen to. So that's quite a powerful kind of presence to have. didn't do much supervision, certainly from my point of view, but so, you know, I live with that. Someone like Richard, I think, was a much more hands-on, and certainly the project of the unpopular education was largely, you know, down to him. He provided the spine of it. Michael I had less to do with, but he was partly in the education group. And then Neil came towards the end of the time we were here. And again, that was part of that Institute of Education connection and interest.
But I think one of the things about the Institute was that the links between the centre and the Institute were developed, or certainly extended far more after our session in London. Or we had that weekend course with, I think, in '78.
Yeah, probably.
Certainly the individuals were coming up asking to come to seminars, and they'd like to do this and like to do that. So, you know, some of the seminar groups were open to people from outside as well. They were invited to come along.
Well, personally, I was staggeringly ignorant probably of the battles they had internally inside the university, trying to protect the space that they kind of created and re-win the SLC kind of grants that they were getting. And to be fair, you know, none of that really came, certainly from my experience, none of that came on the students. You know, that was something staff did themselves.
So you never had you weren't aware of the kind of troubled relationship between the centre and the university?
We were aware of it, I was aware of it, but it was very much going on down the corridor there, and we were privy to the day-to-day realities of all that. We were just aware that it was going on in the background. You know, the grown-ups were dealing with that, so to speak.
Was there this notion of the grown-ups? I know it's something I actually have seen in the archive as well, that kind of people refer to the young upstarts and the grown-ups. Was there kind of not a resentment, but was there kind of a schism between the staff members, the grown-ups, maybe even Paul, we could include in that, and then the younger kind of generation that was coming through?
Well, I mean, I think for me there was a sense that there were people who had a mature relationship to the centre, who'd seen it through a number of years, and then there were people like me who just arrived, and there were debates and struggles that had gone on for a long time that I wasn't privy to. I didn't know who the people were. I didn't know the dynamics of the academic board type situation, you know, and what the realities that were there. I mean, I always assumed, for example, in the context of the admissions group, that those staff members did have some kind of veto on who could come. Whether they ever exercised it, I've got no idea, but I always assumed that there'd be a line which, you know, beyond which they wouldn't go. They'd have to protect the place, so that they would be selective, you know. But in the nature of the battles, there were references to sit-ins that the centre people had been involved in, and the staff had got a bit close to all that. I think Stuart was involved before our time.
No, there was a big sit-in the first year we were here.
No, it was prior to us. We were actually involved in a debate about that with people. You and I went and spoke. Yeah, we were asked to go along by somebody who I knew was in the CP.
What was the sit-in?
It was some dispute.
Was it tuition fees, was it?
I can't remember what it was. I can't even remember what it was about.
Rents, putting a building in the wrong place, or taking a building away, or putting trees in the middle of the bloody common. I don't know. Ladybirds attacking everybody.
We weren't involved like that, but we were asked to offer our view. Somebody said, "What do you think?" And my line was, "Do you honestly think you can win this? Because if you don't, you're going to be wasting your time. You'll be serious about what it is you're trying to do."
Are there any sort of like crises or rebellions in the context of the centre that stick in your mind?
Internally, you mean? In terms of, no, not from my point of view, no, not really. You know, a few argy-bargies in general meetings, but to be quite honest, I used to arrange a lot of my empirical work to coincide with the general meetings. So,
were they just, ridiculously long, or they kind of?
No, just they were bloody. My image of them is, you know, if it was 3 hours, you were lucky. You know, I can't even remember what the agendas were like, what it was about, other than the fucking smoke that Neil is talking about.
And before he gets too righteous, you were the one who used to argue against people in having a smoking ban.
Too bloody right, yeah.
He was the one. I remember at Ruskin. We were at Ruskin once, and there was people saying, you know, comrades, we must have a ban on smoking, and he was getting all right. And my position was, well, as a smoker, I think I'll go outside and have a fag, and if they because if they found it too oppressive, I wouldn't smoke. But there was a lot of ideological.
Did you used to try and avoid the general meetings as well? Or?
Not so much, but I know what Dan means. I probably, there were times when I didn't go or whatever, but I don't know. I mean, I didn't mind sitting there and just listening because it was just interesting. I mean, I was used to long Labour Party meetings where the same debates would go on over and over again, and people sort of somehow felt the need to reiterate what they'd said the previous meeting. I found that a bit tedious.
I've always had a version for the long, tedious meetings.
Yeah, I mean, I just used to turn off and think about other things. But I remember there was one. I think Stuart had some heavy sessions where he found it very. He felt he'd been personally criticised a lot.
There was one real big. Sorry, that one of the conflicts coming back. When Paul Corrigan got banned from the centre.
I remember that happening, but I picked it up after it had happened, so I didn't know what.
You should be careful because it's names.
But it was kind of quite. It could get quite charged, sort of.
Yeah, but I remember Stuart did a piece, I think, for the around about the time the Black in the Union Jack thing, and he did a TV thing, a critique of the TV coverage of the far right, the NF, and he'd done this piece. I forget what the programme was, and when he came back to the centre, I was asked, some conspirators asked me to say something in the general meeting, and it was at the time when Stuart felt he'd been under the cosh a little bit, and I remember basically saying to Stuart, I've been asked to say something about this TV appearance, where you were clearly, we're all associated with you because, you were presented as being the director of the Contemporary Cultural Studies, so we're all by implication involved in what you've done. And I said, I really think that in future you should really think hard about bringing things to the group before you actually present them. And I said, and that's for one main reason, and that's because we could then look at what you're going to be doing when you're there, and if you're wearing the wrong one, we can buy you a new tie. And that was a punchline, you see, because he'd got a knitted tie which he'd had for donkey's years. And Stuart he went, oh. And afterwards he just grabbed me and said, you bastard, he said, because he said, I thought at two Brutus, I was going to stab him in the back. That was a mark of how sensitive he was, but it was just a big wind-up. And some people asked me to do it, so we said, we'll buy you a new tie, Stuart, which is one of the things we did. When he left, we bought him a new tie, but we managed to buy him a tie which was an exact copy of the one he'd been wearing. So there's a joke about the tie there.
Just to sort of, I don't want it to turn into a long and boring meeting like the ones that you
had
back in the time, but there was obviously an emphasis amongst some people anyway on producing, in the sense of producing organic intellectuals. Is that what you both saw yourselves as, and given you both had sort of different careers, like you've gone down the academic route and you've gone on to do other stuff in teaching and such like.
Yeah.
Like how did you kind of conceptualise that notion of an organic intellectual in relation to kind of careers that you've both had?
On a personal basis, just to make it clear, I didn't come down the academic route. Right? After I left the centre, I had a 2-year job with a mob called the William Temple Foundation, which was interesting because they had the theological debates. William Temple was the Archbishop, the workers' Archbishop from the Second World War, very left of centre, Anglican kind of set up, very much tied up with industrial missions. After that, I was unemployed for about 3 years. After that, I was involved in campaigns and pressure groups until I decided that I needed a pension, at which point, because I'd managed to finish the PhD 6 years after I finished at the centre, I then just about done enough to get back in an academic route and get a pension. Right? So just to say that.
Were you an employment unit? Or?
Yeah, that came out of Youth Aid, which was
Youth Aid.
Yeah, which was in the classic pressure group. This it's set up in the early 1980s around, again, mass unemployment, come back on the agenda. So all the stuff I've been doing on youth unemployment, Passives Commission, things like that, all came to a head. And it was a much more interesting policy-oriented, direct campaigning kind of role but also with a bit of a research base to it. Yeah.
So in a sense, then that's almost the you could argue is almost the epitome of this notion of the organic intellectual.
No, completely. Yeah. But it was, and there's no doubt about it. The experience at the Cultural Studies Centre didn't necessarily form that kind of trajectory, but was an important part of it. If nothing, for preventing me getting a job for 3 years when I was looking for one in academia, because I didn't have a PhD. But also that was the first wave of the cuts, similar to the kind of experience that a lot of people are getting.
When I finished in '79, I was teaching in Denmark from 1980 onwards. But I think at that time we were just finishing the unpopular education. I remember spending a lot of time during 80. Unpopular education didn't come out in 81.
Yeah.
So during 80, I remember a lot of the first part of the year doing a lot of writing and working on that. And I think I was with you some other times, so you must have been for a. But so I think between the two of us, we virtually wrote a version of Unpopular Education, typed it out, and we did a hell of a lot of that.
Yeah, my brain's opus.
I know, but I mean, we did that. We did with this one as well. But and then but you're at William and Chandler, so actually there were blocks of time when we were coming to stay. We did some of that work during 80.
Okay.
I remember very clearly. But then I got involved in the strand, which led to me to be working on Vote for Them, and I got very involved in the tracking down people who've been involved in wartime politics and in the forces politics and the education stuff. So I was doing a lot more of that, and then I got a commission from the BBC, so I was working for radio and TV and doing bits and bobs.
Did that fit in with that?
That was all.
Did you see that as being part of the?
That was part of my PhD stuff, and it came directly out of all that.
And probably a much more useful product than a 200-page tome stuck in the middle of a library somewhere.
I don't know. But it
was. Because that's the one of the ironies, I guess, about the centre is that there was this commitment to the notion of organic intellectual, but lots of people, Paul Willis, Paul Gilroy and others, whoever, have gone down quite relatively anyway, classic academic route and become kind of professors and what have you.
Yeah.
So what's your kind of interpretation of that really, especially since you've kind of in a sense done both, you've gone down the kind of campaigning route and such and been unemployed and such and then now you work at Portsmouth University, where do you see the kind of legacies of cultural studies in that respect?
Well, I'm very fortunate because at Portsmouth I've got a deal, which is if I bring in a chunk of money, I make a contribution in Portsmouth, but they allow me to do the kind of applied policy work that I've always done. Hence, going out in interviews this morning, interviewing people who are working with unemployed people up in Aston. So there's a strong thread of continuity kind of there.
Do both in a sense.
Well, both because it is both. Most of my kind of academic work, most of my publications are applied policy kind of work, but I will do just enough to be referable in the jargon. And fortunately, at the time of my career at the moment, I'm not under the pressure that people like yourself will be in terms of making sure you're hitting all those kinds of benchmarks. So the notion of I'm not sure it's a contradiction in terms of whether you can be an organic intellectual in academia. I don't know.
I suppose using that kind of framework, then I think certainly from my point of view, I can recognise how I would fit into that, because my trajectory post-centre was research for TV, radio in the early 80s, and then teaching in higher education for a while. Then I moved sideways into working with kids again, and I spent a number of years working with kids who were excluded in multi-agency environments. So I think certainly from the time I was at the centre, I never again worked in a kind of monocultural environment. It was always very diverse and different strands, multi-agency work, partnership working and so on. So during the 80s I was working with kids who were excluded, but may well be involved in psychiatrists, with psychologists, with school exclusion services, with social services, with, you name it, police. I was working with kids at the hard end, and when I left that at the end of the 80s, I went into a multi-agency policy environment. So I was suddenly involved in forming political policy as well for the city as a senior advisor to the council. And the way in which councils work is that it's officers who write the reports in consultation with the politicians. So I started doing a lot of that, and I was working on big review projects. And one of the things I did, and that was a direct spin-off from my centre work, was I developed the whole idea of the Birmingham Childcare Conference. So I sort of developed all the proposals and got the funding for it and so on when I was working a big review project. And I ran 3 of those, 91, 92 and 94, before the senior officers I was involved with left the city. And there was a change of political leadership, so then that was discontinued, there was no money around anymore. But that was very much about involving lots of different people coming from different areas to actually be involved in discussions about children's services. So I was bringing in people from TV, people from, well, all over Europe as well, people involved in training centres, the whole foyer idea, people from early multi-agency children's services planning in Emilia-Romagna, the European Childcare Network, which was a European Union funded thing. So lots of people from different groups who were outside the traditional social services kind of delivery model to actually do that. Films, theatre groups and so on around the International Convention Centre, which is where we ran the conferences. So that was very different, I think. People thought that was very different. Whereas to me it was a perfectly normal way of doing things. That's what you do at the centre. It was being open to other ideas and different perspectives. When we did the masters, there were people that had got an education and teaching background, other people who arrived having done German degrees, French degrees, philosophy background, sociology, history. So our first degrees were very different. So the idea of coming together and debating things was perfectly normal in that environment.
For you?
It became very normal at the Cultural Studies Centre. So when I was working within conventional delivery of children's services, kids who were being looked after or kids who were in trouble, you didn't want to focus just on the organisations that were traditionally within the City Council for doing that. I brought in other people as well who had different perspectives, different experiences. So opened it all up and got in lots of people. Well, every team in the city, for example, was involved in the childcare conference. So the idea of representation and a range of people being involved was absolutely fundamental. And I suppose that was, when I think back, that was very much derived from my experience of the centre and certainly the way I worked in Roskilde as well. That was very much participatory.
One other kind of slightly different thing, which I think kind of has an influence on my own work, and one of the things that attracted me to the centre in the first place, particularly the work of someone like Willis, was taking what people said seriously. Showing a bit of respect to whatever kind of class background, wherever people came from, and generally kind of working class people who were seen as, the empty vessels or the minor shops and things like that. Sometimes it got a bit too kind of celebratory, but that notion of always having a sense, policy is a lot more complicated than that, etc., etc. But at the very end of it, you still got to listen to what people are saying to you and actually credit them with the intelligence and insight that they're bringing into situations as well, even though it may, they may be expressing things that you don't particularly like and want to do things that you don't particularly kind of agree with. And I got that kind of sense from quite a bit of the work at the centre. There was another thing which just explained them all away, I just thought they were racist nutters. But that was a powerful insight, I think.
Yeah, for me that was listening to what people have said and understanding that, and applying it to the work I was involved in the 90s when I was working in children's services and a thing called Birmingham Action on Childcare, which was that multi-agency approach. One of the things we were interested in was, how in big organisations does child abuse get tolerated. Why is it? And I was interested in kind of looking at change mechanisms and organisation in the context of particular organisation cultures, how these cultures develop, sustained, and so on. So that was listening to what people said about the world and discovering that people had got particular views that derived from certain experiences, and objectively they were completely wrong, but you understood why they developed those views.
Well, it's going back to the kind of Hobbit roots.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
not
absolutely.
just the-
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's, you know, one of the most powerful things and insights of cultural studies,
Yeah.
albeit it's lost and dissipated through
Yeah.
whatever the kind of weird and wonderful thousand flowers that it's now bloomed into. The other thing, just to get this on camera, that we shouldn't, you know, it's been a bit bloody serious, right? It was a lot of fun, right? So there were a lot of visits to
Did you think
pubs.
it
There
was
was there were quite a lot of good times to be had. So yeah, so don't miss
I remember when,
don't miss that. You
I
know?
remember when Stuart was on Desert Island Discs, I don't know if you've heard of it.
Yeah, I have actually.
But he actually talks about laughter and dancing, I think.
Right,
about
okay.
having a good time. And that was very true in some of the parties.
Just vaping on this. Seriously?
Yeah.
Bloody hell. Yeah, anybody these days, isn't it?
He's going to watch this, dear.
It's a good positive note to end on, so thanks a lot. Thanks for
Exactly.
your time.
We know how
Thank
to
you.
wrap up interviews, mate.